this lecture will cover poetry. So why do we think that poetry is so important in an early learning environment? Well, we know that poetry helps children to develop listening skills. We know that activities with poetry hold opportunities to promote language and literacy by associating pleasure with words. And we know that the language of rhyme becomes easily fixed in our memory. So these are things that emerge in the research. We know that children do learn to develop stronger listening skills if they are exposed to poetry. We do know that when children associate pleasure with words, they're more likely to have opportunities to engage in language and literacy and be successful in that way. And we do know, of course, that when something rhymes, we can remember it more easily. That's why even adults have little rhymes that they use to remember, let's say, how many days are in the months of the year, for example. Poetry is just full of wordplay, and children love words that are fun to say. It's almost like it tastes good to them. They just love to say fun and funny words in terms of poetry. So we want to give kids lots of opportunities to engage in poetry because it provides new opportunities for children to learn new words, new ideas and attitudes, and to experience life through the eyes of the poet. When we are exposed to something repeatedly, it becomes part of our lexicon or part of our vocabulary, and it happens when it's introduced in a way that it's just kind of given to us. So for example, saying carpe diem or hakuna matata, those were things that were not in our lexicon before, really. Before Dead Poets Society, nobody said carpe diem, and now people say it a lot, and a lot of people know what it means. And people didn't really say hakuna matata a whole lot before The Lion King came out, and so poetry serves that same function. You can introduce a phrase or a new word, and then it stays with you, and then people use it. We use common poems to remember life elements, like the months of the year, for example. Poetry has form and order. It's dependable and easy to learn. And poetry verse includes lines of a poem or poetry with imaginative or conceptual power. So we use poetry for a variety of reasons. We want children to be familiar, and we want to expose them to classic and contemporary poetry that is considered part of our literary heritage. So for example, when we teach kids something like This Little Piggy Went to Market, maybe it's because we ourselves had parents that did that with our little feet and our little toes, and they did that little poem with us. We like to pass on childhood poems and share poems that we heard growing up, because there's something about our heritage being passed on that we really love that. And so there are wider shared literary heritages where you can see that many people in a whole culture would have been exposed to a particular poem. And then within that, there are smaller cultural groups where things are passed on as part of our heritage as well. We also want to train children to experience the pleasure of hearing sounds. Here's the thing about oral language, is in order to go on to read and to learn to decode words and figure out that letters represent certain sounds and you can put those together to make words, you've got to be able to hear sounds. It's completely meaningless to try to attach a letter to a sound unless you can hear the sound. And poetry allows us to hear the sound. It fosters that skill of forcing us to listen in a way that we are deliberately paying attention to what something sounds like. It helps us, also poetry helps us provide enjoyment through the use of poems with silly words and humor. Lots of our poems are very silly. It stimulates children's imaginations because of that. We've got poems about, people who won't take the garbage out, or monsters, or funny characters who do funny things, or counting, and it stimulates our enjoyment. And our imaginations too, because often poems are about things that seem ridiculous or would be difficult for it to happen. It increases our vocabulary and knowledge, because poems do introduce new vocabulary concepts to us. And poems help us build our self-worth and self-confidence. If we can engage in poetry and rhyming, children are so proud when they think of a rhyme. It makes us feel good. And it helps us understand the concept of rhyming. Again, we're listening to sounds, we're hearing sounds, we're noticing when sounds are the same. So it helps our understanding of that, and it also encourages us, of course, to continue to move forward in that area. It's important to note that poetry is connected to early reading ability, because rhyming words teach a child that different words can share some of the same sounds. Cat, bat, pat, wow, they really sound very similar, but something's different about all of them. Going through that exercise of distinguishing what's the same and what's different teaches us that notion that different words can share some of the same sounds. And our ability to discriminate and create rhyming words and sense the rhythm of words is very closely linked to early reading ability in the research. So what about nursery rhymes? Well, this is something really interesting. Nursery rhymes fell out of fashion for a while. Mother Goose rhymes. You can see a little picture of Mother Goose on this slide. And as nursery rhymes became kind of unpopular, people thought like, well, some of them are kind of weird. Why did Peter Pumpkin Eater put his wife in a pumpkin shell? That's so odd. But really, what we have found out is that nursery rhymes, which are folk sayings with rhyming words for very young children, what we have found out in the research is that there is a specific and strong relationship between knowledge of nursery rhymes and the development of phonological skills, hearing those letter sounds. And this trend has not emerged using other types of poetry. So as I said, we moved away from nursery rhymes for a while in favor of other poets. Shel Silverstein is very popular, A Pizza the Size of the Sun series. Of course, we all love Dr. Seuss. But nursery rhymes seem to be very effective in teaching us our phonological skills. And this includes not only rhyme, which is when the ending sounds are the same, but also alliteration, where you have the beginning sounds of words that sound the same. And we've even found that knowledge of nursery rhymes in the early years predicts success in spelling 2 to 3 years later. So this is a robust indicator that seems to take us a long way, and it's nursery rhymes. So why? What would it be about nursery rhymes that would make it more effective than other types of rhymes? Well, if you think about nursery rhymes, Jack be nimble, Jack be quick, Jack jumped over the candlestick. That's really nice and short, and you can wrap your mouth around that and produce that. And we're actually talking now about how nursery rhymes might even be particularly effective with children who might be English language learners, because it's short enough. The Cat in the Hat is a really long book to try to rhyme all the way through. But Jack be nimble, Jack be quick, Jack jump over the candlestick, a very young child, even a very new language learner, can produce that. So we think that part of it is it's just not as daunting or intimidating, and the kids like the silliness of Mother Goose rhymes. So anyway, integrating Mother Goose rhymes into your classroom seems to be very effective for fostering some of these skills that we really want to teach. So here are 3 elements of good poetry to consider. The first element of good poetry is having distinguished diction, or clarity of speech and enunciation. So they're words that in their own way seem to contribute to our own ability to pronounce them, and they sound appealing to us, and they have kind of nice, strong sounds that promote this clarity of speech and being able to enunciate it and use that distinguished diction. Also, another element of good poetry is that there are carefully chosen words and phrases with rich sensory and associated meanings. So when I think of the story about Sarah Sylvia Cynthia Stout, who wouldn't take the garbage out, by Shel Silverstein, I can really imagine. It's so descriptive, and it goes through so much detail, and there's so much sensory information. I feel like I'm there. And that's something that we really love about good poems, is that you have some sensory information that allows you to connect to the poem. And of course, not just sensory words, but meaning words, so that you can kind of really understand what's meant to happen in this poem. whether it's long or short. Not every poem is going to have a super long story, but it's got to have that interesting wording and allow you to be able to visualize it and connect to it in some way through these details. And then the other component is significant content. Does it communicate something to you? If it's communicating silliness and nonsense words, that's okay, but then that's then the message of the significant content. Or if it's telling a story, then is it communicating that? So these are the three elements of good poetry, and so we want to see those three things come together. So there are different types of poetry. Couplets are stanzas of 2 rhyming lines. Children love them because they're short and can be easily memorized. I've already given you one example, which was Jack be nimble, Jack be quick, Jack jump over the candlestick is an example of a couplet. Lyric poetry is melodic, and it's descriptive, and it has almost a song quality to it. Narrative poetry is poetry that tells a story. So, like the Odyssey is narrative poetry. It just tells a really, really long story. And a limerick has 5 lines of verse and a specific rhyming pattern. Free verse is poetry that does not rhyme. So you have an example of free verse up at the top of this slide. That's an example of free verse. And then nonsense poetry is poetry that's often ridiculous and whimsical, like supercalifragilisticexpialidocious. That's an example of a nonsense poetry phrase that's inserted into a larger song, which is, of course, also a poem. Some important elements of poetry are listed for you here on this slide. So assonance is repetition of words of identical or similar vowel sounds followed by different consonant sounds. Figurative language is language that's enriched by word images and figures of speech. Similes include comparisons of 2 things that are alike, usually using the words like or as, and metaphors are figures of speech in which a comparison is implied by analogy but is not stated. So here are some examples of similes and metaphors. So in a metaphor, you're describing something, but you never use the term like and you never use the term as. So you don't say, oh, it was like a giant wheel. That's not a metaphor, that's a simile. Because in a metaphor, you do not use the term like or as. You describe it, but without using the word as and without using the word like. So here are some examples of metaphors. The snow is a white blanket spread across the whole valley. The hospital was a refrigerator. The classroom was a zoo. Children were everywhere. Things were all over the floor. It was almost as it was a zoo. Life is a roller coaster. There are ups, there are downs. Life is a roller coaster. Now in a simile, you use the word as, you can use the word like. Oh, it was as big as an elephant. I had never seen such a large thing. Oh gosh, I am as blind as a bat without my contact lenses. He was as brave as a lion. They were as busy as bees. They were just like little bees, buzzing all day, working industriously, taking honey to the hive. Those are similes, using the word like or as. Now, assonance, I mentioned 2 slides back. Assonance is when you are repeating a vowel sound in the middle. So an example of assonance that you might come across in children's poetry is here for you on this slide. So West Beast, East Beast by Dr. Seuss has quite a bit of assonance. You can see the vowel sounds repeated. Upon an island hard to reach, the East Beast sits upon his beach. Upon the West Beach sits the West Beast. Each Beast thinks he's the best beast. Which beast is best? Well, I thought at first that the East was best and the West was worst. Then I looked again from the West to the East, and I liked the beast on the East Beach least. So you see, actually, there's not as much rhyming on this page as you would expect to see when you think of rhyming as a traditional having the ending sounds be the same. What makes this feel like it rhymes is that use of assonance, because you keep hearing the similar sound of that elongated E vowel sound. So that's what assonance sounds like. Now, alliteration is when the beginning sound is the same. So you can see even the graphic on the top left corner says poetry, powerful points and puny packages. That's an example of alliteration. Alliteration is also the thing that makes tongue twisters even more difficult to say. So you've got these beginning, repeated, ending sounds, and in tongue twisters, they take it to a level of an extreme, and that's why it's a little bit tricky to say these. So here are some common examples that you may have heard of before. Peter Piper picked a peck of pickled peppers, a peck of pickled peppers Peter Piper picked. If Peter Piper picked a peck of pickled peppers, how many pickled peppers did Peter Piper pick? The next one, also very common. Many of us may have heard this growing up. How much wood would a woodchuck chuck if a woodchuck could chuck wood? A woodchuck would chuck all the wood he could chuck if a woodchuck would chuck wood. Now, Silly Sally is also a tricky one. Silly Sally swiftly shooed 7 silly sheep. The 7 silly sheep Silly Sally shooed, shilly-shallied south. These sheep shouldn't sleep in a shack. Sheep should sleep in a shed. So that's the difference between alliteration and assonance, and then, of course, you know the difference now between similes and metaphors as well. So popular preschool poems tend to have some strong similarities. So one is they have a very simple storyline. It's not super elaborate like poetry for an older child. So again, with Jack Be Nimble, it doesn't get any simpler than that. Also, children like simple storylines with finger play, so things like This Little Piggy, where you have finger play involved with it. That's fun for them. Stories and songs with repeated chorus, like London Bridge. You know, you always, like, you go through the different choruses, but you always keep coming back to London Bridge is falling down. Stories with nonsense words, like Hey Diddle Diddle, the cat and the fiddle, the cow jumped over the moon, the little dog laughed to see such sport, and the dish ran away with the spoon. Those are nonsense words. Hey Diddle Diddle. You also will find that children really like poems with descriptions of daily actions. So, Little Jack Horner sat in a corner eating his pie. He stuck in his thumb and pulled out a plum and said, "What a good boy am I." That's a daily action description. And then there are choral reading opportunities where children can join in with rhymed words, like in the chorus. Like to market. When you read a poem like that, then children will jump in and they will all say things like to market. So these are all aspects of preschool poems that are really well received and still seem to meet our goals of fostering oral literacy. So some ways to introduce children to poetry. First of all, post poems in conspicuous places so that children can see them easily. Use pictures and flannel boards to help foster the ideas that you're trying to communicate in your poem. It can also be helpful to mount cut magazine pictures and try to think up words that rhyme with whatever's pictured. You know, that's something you can do spur of the moment, like, oh, your assembly got canceled? Oh, we can't go outside for recess right now because it just started to rain and we need a quick 15-minute activity. You can just grab something and cut out, you know, a few pictures, like, oh, here's a cat, oh, here's a car. What are some words that sound like cat? What are some words that sound like car? And, you know, try to think up those words. Nursery songs are great. Making up your own poetry and using elements that's meaningful for the children, that's a great activity to do, and it's part of why you will be required in CHD 118 to also engage in writing your own poetry, because it's a great exercise. Again, it helps children figure out that they have something fun to communicate, and they need to see us modeling that so that they can learn that also about themselves. Other teacher techniques: be enthusiastic about your poems. I cannot underscore enough the importance of really engaging and being silly with the kids. They need to see that because it gives them permission to do the same thing. Have children join in with shorter poems. Allow individual children to share or recite poems. Pay attention to our natural breaks in the way that we pronounce words. You can use poetry charts so that children can see the word also. and allow children to create their own rhymes. And this should be done verbatim without teacher correction. So when they are first coming up with their rhymes, they'll say cat, bat, lat. They don't care that lat is not a word that they're, that they don't, what they're excited to discover is that they can, make up a word. And so they will make up nonsense words, but it's still something that we want to foster, especially if we've given them the task to create their own rhyme. Even if it doesn't rhyme perfectly, we just roll with it because they're still learning. It's kind of their own invented poetry, and that process is going to teach them a lot. So final thoughts. You want to give kids the opportunity to create poetry. You want to make sure that you include it in your classroom, that you use poetry a lot, that you introduce the kids to poetry, that you talk about beginning sounds and ending sounds, even if you're not calling, in your 3-year-old classroom, you're not going to say, today we're going to talk about beginning sounds. But that you do it, that you give opportunity for the children to hear it over and over again is so important for fostering that oral literacy. And beyond that, it's also important because children will learn to create their own message and use their own voice to produce that message. And that is ultimately what we want them to think. We want them to feel that children, that they are poets too, and that they have something to say, that they have a voice that can be heard, and that's really empowering, even as it's also fostering our oral literacy goals. It also is giving us this giant impetus to move forward and find our voice and to communicate to others. And ultimately, that is the goal of preschool literacy efforts, is to allow children to figure out that they have something that they want to communicate and that they'll be able to share that.